Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for the semester. Tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 6, where we are going to cover social structure theory. And this is kind of an interesting concept as you look at it, and I think you'll find it interesting as we start to look at some of the objectives for tonight's lecture. So what we plan on doing tonight is to take a look at or even explain the association between what we call social structure and crime. We're going to identify some of the elements of what we call social disorganization theory. We're going to analyze and take a close look at a couple of viewpoints of individuals by the name of Shaw and McKay. We're going to differentiate between the various elements of ecological theory, and we're also going to discuss the concept of strain and what is known as strain theory. And then finally, we'll wrap everything up where we're going to basically compare some of the elements of cultural deviance theory. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into our case study for tonight. So in 2012, Aaron Hernandez, New England Patriots football player, signed a $40 million contract with the Patriots at only 22 years old. Hernandez had grown up poor, working menial jobs in Connecticut. He hung out with a tough crowd in kind of a bad neighborhood, and he did have some visible, what people believe were gang tattoos. And he was saved by his incredible athletic ability, in essence. And Hernandez set scoring records in high school football and was recruited to the University of Florida, where he became a collegiate All-American football player, and he entered the NFL as one of the youngest players. Now, despite his success, Hernandez really couldn't shake his early life, and a lot of times was hanging out with his old friends from the hood, if you will. And while in college, he also got into a fight with a bouncer at a bar. He was questioned by the police about a shooting that had injured two men, and he was supposedly with his friends or crew, if you will, at that time. Now, Hernandez was suspended as a sophomore for an undisclosed violation of team rules. And by his junior year, he acknowledged testing positive for marijuana. Now, all of that really doesn't mean a lot, but as we read further or discuss further, we're going to kind of find that out. On June 26, 2013, an incident that made national headlines, Hernandez was arrested on suspicion of the murder of Odin Lloyd, a 27-year-old semi-professional football player who was dating the sister of Hernandez's fiance by the name of Cheyenne Jenkins. And it seemed that the two men had begun socializing together and sharing secrets, and Hernandez became angry at Lloyd when he suspected he was talking to people about a prior incident, the shooting of two men with whom Hernandez had a disagreement with earlier at a Boston nightclub. Now, although no murder weapon was found and no witnesses to the shooting of Lloyd came forward, prosecutors had an overwhelming amount of physical evidence and were able to get a jury to convict Hernandez, and he received a life sentence without hope of parole. And Hernandez was also charged with the earlier double murder. And on April 19th, 2017, Hernandez was found dead in his cell at the Correctional Center in Massachusetts, where he was being held. And his mannerism of death was he had hanged himself by a bedsheet that he attached to a window. Now, ironically, just 5 days before, he had been found not guilty in that double murder case. And things kind of seemed to be going in his direction, if you will. And he was also in the process of appealing the conviction on that Lloyd case. And in the aftermath of his suicide, friends and fellow athletes kind of lamented the tragic life and death of this very gifted but troubled athlete. And many argue that he could not really shake the roots where he came from, and brought, in essence, his gang associations and lifestyle with him, first to college and then to professional football. So with that being said, to criminologists, it really does come as no surprise that someone who grew up in a poor, deteriorated urban neighborhood, who was immersed in street culture and values, will get involved in violent behavior. And even someone like Aaron Hernandez, who seemed to have escaped poverty, if you will. And many kids in these areas grow up hopeless and alienated, believing that they have little chance of being part of what we like to call the American dream, if you will. Hernandez and many like Hernandez become in the gang culture, and there are now an estimated about 31,000 gangs, with about 850,000 gang members in the United States, and that number varies a little bit. The numbers of gangs and gang memberships, they do continue to increase, and there are more than 2,300 gang-related homicides each year, more than 15% of all murders that occur in the U.S. And even when opportunity presents itself, the lure of, or the allure of, gangster lifestyle is kind of hard to shake. Now, noting the universal associations between poverty, neighborhood conditions, and criminal behavior, social structure theorists, which is kind of where we're going tonight, suggests that antisocial behavior is a direct result of destructive social forces on human behavior. And according to this view, it is social forces, not individual traits, that tend to cause crime. Inner city residents are indigent and desperate, not abnormal, calculating, or evil. And raised in deteriorated parts of town, they lack the social support and economic resources available to more affluent members of society. So something like dealing drugs or joining a gang holds the promise of economic rewards and status enhancements that the conventional world simply can't provide, or that person can't get. And I put in here a very interesting thing, and we'll talk more about this later, but this is the book Monster, the autobiography of an LA gang member. This is Monster Cody Scott. I'd like you to, you don't have to, but there's a link to a video where he talks a little bit about himself and growing up, and how he basically has evolved and even kind of changed. So before we jump right into our lecture and jump into the economic structure and American society, as we talk more about the social structure theory, fact or fiction, something we do at the beginning of every chapter that we go through, just to get your brain kind of moving. And you're probably used to it by now. So, fact or fiction: very few children live in poverty because the government has made child poverty a priority. And fact or fiction: crime rates go down in a healthy economy and rise with unemployment. Now, we'll talk about some of these possibly as we go through, and if I don't, if nothing else, hopefully it will get you to kind of think about things. So, people in the United States live in what we call a stratified society. And this is groupings according to, let's say, social status or levels. So again, people in the United States live in this stratified society, and social strata are created by the unequal distribution of wealth and power and prestige. And social classes are segments of the population whose members have a relatively similar portion of desirable things, and who share attitudes, values, norms, and an identifiable lifestyle. So a difference kind of between stratified society and social classes, but you can see how they go together. Now, in U.S. society, it is common to identify people as belonging to the upper middle or lower socioeconomic class, although a broad range of economic variations exist within each group. The upper middle class is reserved for a small number of exceptionally well-to-do families, if you will, who control enormous financial and social resources. Income inequality has become a national, social, and political concern. So when we kind of talk a little bit further, and we'll get to that, but when you look at these two pictures, on the left is my buddy JT, and on the right is my other buddy Taylor Swift. And is there an identifiable class that we put people into? And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but when you look at the contrasting photos, I think we all have a little space, bubble, or place that we kind of basically categorize individuals as. So what about living in poverty? And it even goes to cars. When you look on the left, you've got some interesting vehicles, and on the right, you have kind of a upper middle class type set of vehicles. And we do tend to classify individuals based on that. So with that being said, while the wealthy live lives of affluence, there are now about 46 million Americans living in poverty, defined as a family of four earning about $24,000 per year, who have a scant amount or if any resources, and suffer socially and economically as a result. And those living below the poverty line are often forced to live in inadequate housing, having poor health care, and suffering from disrupted families, unemployment, and even despair. And they are more prone to things like depression, less likely to have achievement motivation, and are unable to put off immediate gratification for future gain. Kids living in poverty areas may also drop out of school before graduation because the rewards for educational achievement are in the distant future. Clearly, the wealth gap creates two Americas, if you will. One that can afford the luxuries the world can offer, and the other just kind of scraping by, often with government assistance to supplement their particular earnings. And if you look at child poverty, more than 20% of all youth, about 15 million individuals, live in families with incomes below the poverty line. Another 22% escape poverty but live in families considered to be poor. And many kids living in poverty have working parents, but low wages and unstable employment leaves their families struggling to make ends meet. Being a child in a low income or poor family doesn't happen by chance and is a function of parental education and employment, race and ethnicity, and other factors associated with economic insecurity. So there are some things here. Well, what about a little bit more specific now? We talk a little bit about minority group poverty. The burdens of underclass life are often felt most acutely by minority group members. Many Americans are able to take full advantage of the educational and vocational opportunities in American society. However, the door to these advantages is often closed to racial and ethnic minorities. And you've heard of a couple of different things. You've heard of the phrase white privilege. I'm not sure if I kind of get into it. I don't, but I'm gonna run through it just really quick. The assumed societal privileges that benefit uh, Caucasians and provide them with opportunities not available to non-white individuals under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. And even more so, we've seen some action by a group called Black Lives Matter, or BLM. And this is a movement whose aim is to reduce the institutional violence and perceived systematic racism towards African American individuals. Now, when it comes to social structure and crime, before I get there, I want to kind of back up and address some of the problems, if you will, of the lower class. Now, in 1966, sociologist Oscar Lewis argued that the crushing lifestyle of lower class areas produces what we call a culture of poverty that is passed from one generation to the next. Apathy, cynicism, helplessness, and mistrust of social institutions such as schools or government agencies, and even law enforcement mark the culture of poverty. And this mistrust prevents the inner city poor from taking full advantage of the opportunities available to them. So now we're going to move into how this social structure, now that we kind of know what it is, we've talked about economic structure and living in poverty and child poverty, and even problems affiliated with the lower class. But now let's look at how social structure interacts with crime. So according to social structure theory, the root cause of crime can be traced directly to the socioeconomic disadvantages that have become embedded in American society. The social problems found in lower class areas have been described as an epidemic that spreads through a community, destroying the inner workings that enable neighborhoods to survive. They become hollowed out as neighborhood quality decreases. The probability that residents will develop problems sharply increases. And that kind of makes sense. And because they lack ties to the mainstream culture, some lower class individuals are driven to desperate measures such as crime and substance abuse to cope with their economic plight. And crime and violence may also take the form of a slow epidemic, if you will, with a course consisting of stages, something like onset or peak and decline. And violence and crime have been found to spread when let me kind of back up. Violence and crime have been found to spread and then contract in a pattern similar to what we might look at as kind of like a contagious disease. So again, people might, because of economics, might turn to a life of crime. So according to the social structure theory, again, to kind of bring it back around again, the cause of crime can be traced directly to the socioeconomic disadvantages that have been embedded in our society. Now, Aristotle kind of wrote something interesting, not to get too far off track, but he wrote that poverty is the parent of crime. And that's a super interesting thought, especially when we talk about what we're talking about now. But so with that said, is there a connection between poverty and crime? A real connection, if you will. And if there is, we want to describe the connection between poverty and crime. So let me kind of fill in the rest of a couple of gaps, and then we'll move forward. So because lower class children are exposed to a continual stream of violence, they are therefore then more likely to engage in violent acts themselves. Their involvement with conventional social institutions such as schools and after-school programs is either absent or blocked, which puts them at risk for things like recruitment into gangs And when informal and formal avenues of social control have become broken down or frayed, kids are given a free hand to mix with deviant peers, meaning that they've got no other reason other than what they have in front of them to do. The impact of poverty then is felt most often during the teen years and diminishes over time, helping to explain why crime involvement tends to drop as people get a little bit older. So let's look now at some of these social structure theories, and there are a couple that we're going to look at. At its core, or at their core, social structure theories have a very basic theme. A person is the product of their environment. And these theories view the cause of crime through the lens of things like what we've already talked about: poverty, income equality, hopelessness, and despair. And social and economic forces operating again in these lower class areas push many of their residents into criminal behavior patterns. It seems logical that if crime rates are higher in lower class urban centers than in middle class suburbs, social forces must influence or control some of that behavior. So the social structure perspective is going to encompass, if you will, three independent yet overlapping branches. So now here's where we're going to kind of look at three different things. The first one is social disorganization theory. So according to the social disorganization theory, crime flourishes in a disorganized area in which institutions of social control, such as the family, commercial establishments, schools, have broken down and can no longer perform their expected or stated functions. So strain theory, which is, again, this is number 2 on the list here, holds that crime occurs when members of the lower class experience anger and frustration over their inability to, let's say, achieve success. Because they fail to achieve success through conventional or regular means, lower class individuals feel the strain of that, pushing some to find alternative means of achieving their life goals. Therefore, striving for success may involve engaging in criminal activities. And you can see how these kind of overlap a little bit. And then the third one here, and this is just kind of the overview, we're going to get into each one of these a little bit more, is cultural deviance theory. And this combines elements of both strain and social disorganization. In disorganized neighborhoods, the presence of strain locks people into independent subcultures, if you will, with very unique values and beliefs. And criminal behavior is an expression of conformity to lower class subculture values and traditions that are often at odds with conventional society. So a subculture, just so you know what it is a set of values, beliefs, and traditions unique to a particular social class or a group within a larger society. So example could be even gangs. So links to crime rates, to neighborhoods, can also include some what we call ecological characteristics. And again, this is kind of, we're still under the social disorganization theory. Social disorganization theory links crime rates to neighborhood ecological characteristics. Crime rates are highest in transient, mixed use areas and changing neighborhoods in which the fabric of social life has again kind of broken down or have been frayed. And when these failing communities are numerous, or contiguous, or in close proximity to the criminologic effect, it may multiply. And youths living in one disorganized area who visit friends and family in adjoining communities discover these areas are equally dangerous and deteriorated. So a lot of times what this causes is you'll have residents in crime-ridden neighborhoods. They want to get out, so they flee at the earliest opportunity. And the reason they leave is because a lot of these areas are unable to provide the essential services, things like education, healthcare, or even proper housing. And just a couple of photos to kind of help you with your thought process on whether or not you think that some of these theories are valid in your own mind. So that brings us to the work of Shaw and McKay. So social disorganization theory was in fact popularized by the work of two Chicago sociologists, Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay, who linked life in a transitional slum areas to the inclination of crime. Now, Shaw and McKay began their pioneering work on Chicago crime during the 1920s while working as researchers for state-supported social service agencies. And Shaw and McKay explained crime and delinquency within the context of changing urban environments and ecological development in the city. And they saw that Chicago had developed into pretty much two distinct areas or neighborhoods, some affluent and others racked by extreme poverty. And these poverty-ridden transitional neighborhoods suffered high rates of population turnover and were incapable of inducing residents to remain and defend the neighborhoods against the criminal groups. So they kind of broke these down into areas that had experienced excessive crime. So what they noted here was that there was a distinct, again, ecological, or distinct ecological areas that had developed in the city, forming a series of 9 zones, and that there were stable and significant interzone differences in crime rates. And the areas with the most crime appeared to be the inner city zones, where large numbers of individuals lived, and that was the areas with the city's poorest population where they had settled. And if you look at the photographs here, or the images, you can see that the Roman numerals here represent the rate of male delinquency, and the numbers represent the crime zone, or the crime rates in the various zones. And you can see that the inner city, how much higher it is. So crime rates decline in zones furthest from the inner city. And that kind of, it does kind of make sense a little bit when you look at it, that as you get further out, that would possibly change. So now we're going to kind of move into another aspect, if you will, of this disorganization theory. So contemporary social disorganization theory seeks to identify the ecological conditions, poverty, disorganization, instability, incivility, economy that produces high crime rates, and while doing so, formulate strategies to bring these community level crime rates down. So with that said, we're going to talk about the social ecology school. And contemporary social disorganization theorists, again, seek to identify the ecological conditions of crime and disorder. And the social ecology school is an interdisciplinary approach to the study of interdependent social and environmental problems that cause crime. So again, they're going to look at things like community disorder. Crime rates are associated with community deterioration, disorder, poverty, and fear of crime. They're going to look at community fear in areas where people help each other. Residents are less likely to experience fear of crime. As fear increases, life quality tends to deteriorate. And there is, just so you know, there is this thing, fear of crime. Siege mentality, where people who live in areas that experience high levels of crime and civil disorder become suspicious and mistrusting. And minority groups or minority group members may experience greater levels of fear than, let's say, white individuals, perhaps because they have fewer resources to address the ongoing social problems. At some point, they're going to develop a sense of powerlessness with increased levels of mistrust. Again, some consider the authority to somewhat be the enemy. And, you know, siege mentality often results in, again, expanding mistrust of social institutions, including things like law enforcement. So some photos from Missouri and what happened in Ferguson. And not just maybe law enforcement, but mistrust of business or government and schools. And government officials, you know, are in there as well. And sometimes the police here are believed to ignore crime in minority communities. And when they do take action, sometimes they use excessive force against young individuals. And we can see that a little bit from the issues that stemmed from the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri. And so kind of moving forward a little bit, getting a little bit back on track now, community change. This is still under the social ecology school, where we're looking at causes of crime and the study of social environment, etc. Community change. As areas decline, residents start to flee to safer, more affluent neighborhoods. Poverty concentration. One aspect of community change may be the concentration of poverty in certain urban neighborhoods. Another phrase that falls underneath here, but while it's separate, it still overlaps, is something that's called collective efficacy. So cohesive communities with high levels of social control and social integration, where people know one another and develop interpersonal ties, develop what we call collective efficacy. And this is a sense of mutual trust, a willingness to intervene in the supervision of children and in the maintenance of public order. And there's a cohesion among neighborhood residents, combined with shared expectations for informal social control of public space. This promotes what we call collective efficacy. And residents in these areas do enjoy a better life and lifestyle because the fruits of cohesiveness can be better education, can be better health care, better housing, and things like that. Now, in contrast, in socially disorganized neighborhoods where the population is, let's say, transient and interpersonal relationships are superficial and non-supportive, efforts at social control are basically weak. So collective efficacy, by definition, before we kind of move on, is social control exerted by cohesive communities and based on mutual trust, including intervention in the supervision of children, and maintenance of public order, etc. So now, while we know the definition of collective efficacy, let's look at the three forms of collective efficacy that are listed in your textbook. The first one is what we call informal social control. So some elements of collective efficacy operate on the primary or private level and involve peers, families, and relatives. And these sources exert informal control by either awarding or withholding approval, respect, and admiration. Informal control mechanisms include direct criticism, ridicule, ostracism, and even physical punishment. The most important wielder of informal social control is the family, which may keep at-risk kids in check through such mechanisms as effective parenting, withholding privileges, or something similar along those lines. And here are some of the forms of social control. When you look at that, schools and churches, these are some forms of that. Some other forms of social control could be law enforcement. This is one of those in there, so you can see the important role that plays. And there's a chart here too that I threw in that talks about Sean McKay's efforts and the whole social ecology theory as well. So now we're going to kind of move into strain theory. So we're going to talk a little bit about strain theories and how this fits into this ecology, if you will, of crime. So inhabitants of a disorganized inner city area feel isolated, frustrated, ostracized from the economic mainstream, hopeless, and eventually angry. So how do these feelings affect criminal activities? Well, strain theorists view crime as a direct result of frustration and anger among the lower socioeconomic classes. Although most people share similar values and goals, the ability to achieve personal goals is stratified by socioeconomic class. So strain is limited in affluent areas because educational and vocational opportunities are available. Now, in disorganized areas, strain is at a higher level because legitimate avenues for success are all but closed. To relieve the strain, those individuals may achieve their goals through deviant methods such as theft or drug trafficking, or they may reject socially accepted goals and substitute more deviant goals such as being tough or even aggressive. So there's a conflict here between the goals and the means, if that makes sense. And sociologist Robert Merton applied the sociological concept first identified by Durkheim to criminology in his theory of anomie, or you can say anomie, whichever one kind of floats your boat, or you can even say anomic conditions. Now, he found that two elements of culture interact to produce potentially anomic conditions: culturally defined goals and socially approved means for obtaining them. U.S. society stresses the goals of acquiring wealth, success, and power. Socially permissible means include things like hard work, education, and thrift. Now, Merton argues that in the United States, again, legitimate means to acquire wealth are kind of stratified across class and status lines. And those with little education then and few economic resources find that they are denied the ability to legally acquire wealth. So Merton argues that each person has his or her own concept of society's goals and his or her own degree of access to attain them. Some people have inadequate means of attaining success. Others who have the means reject societal goals. And the result are what we call social adaptations. And so Merton here covers a couple of these social adaptations, and we're going to go over them quickly. The first one is conformity. Let me see if I put these individually. Okay, I don't know if I did. Okay, I didn't, so that's fine. So let's go back. So this is when individuals embrace conventional social goals and have the means to attain them. They can choose to conform and they remain law-abiding. Innovation, when individuals accept these goals of society but are unwilling to attain them through legitimate means, the resulting conflict forces them to adopt innovative solutions regarding their dilemma. So they steal or sell drugs or extort money. And of the 5 adaptations, innovation is the most closely associated with criminal behavior. Ritualism, this is number 3. Ritualists gain pleasure from practicing traditional ceremonies regardless of whether they have a real purpose or goal. The strict customs in religious orders, feudal societies, clubs, and college fraternities encourage the appeal to ritualists. Repeatism is number 4, and these individuals reject both the goals and the means of society. They attempt to escape their lack of success by withdrawing either mentally or physically through things like taking drugs or becoming drifters and moving from place to place. And then finally, rebellion. Some individuals substitute an alternative set of goals and means for conventional ones. Revolutionaries who wish to promote radical change in existing social culture and who call for alternative lifestyles, goals, and beliefs are in fact engaging in rebellion. And rebellion may be a reaction against a corrupt or hated government or an effort to create an alternative opportunity and lifestyle within an existing system. So these are Merton's deviance typology, if you will, and you can see how he has it set out. So with that, and again, so we've looked at the evaluate or the Anami theory and then Merton's social adaptations. When it comes to evaluating Anami theory, according to Anami theory, social inequality leads to perceptions of Anami, and to resolve the goals means conflict and relieve the person's sense of strain. Some individuals innovate, again, by stealing or extorting money, and others retreat into drugs and alcohol, and some rebel by joining revolutionary groups, and still others get involved in ritualistic behavior by joining some type of cult or something like that. Now, by linking deviant behavior to the success goals that control social behavior, Anami theory attempts to pinpoint the cause and conflict that engenders personal frustration and consequent criminality. So Anami theorists view the American dream as both kind of a goal and a process. So an individual by the name of Stephen Messner and Richard Rosenfield came up with institutional anomie theory. And this is an updating of Merton's work. And for these two, the American dream again refers to both a goal and a process. As a goal, the American dream involves accumulating stuff, material goods, and wealth via an open via open individual competition. As a process, it involves both being socialized to pursue material success and believing that prosperity is achievable in American culture. And there are a couple other real quick ones. We talk about institutional anomie theory. We kind of just went over that. Again, the American dream, what it refers to is goals and process. There's also another kind of subset here called relative deprivation theory. And there is ample evidence that neighborhood level income inequality is a significant predictor of neighborhood crime rates. Sharp divisions between the rich and the poor create an atmosphere of envy and mistrust. And criminal motivation is fueled both by perceived humiliation and by the perceived right to humiliate a victim in return. Psychologists warn that under these circumstances, young males will begin to fear and envy winners who are doing very well at their expense. And if they fail to use risky, aggressive tactics, they are surely going to lose out in social competition and have little chance of future success. And these generalized feelings are what forms this theory of relative deprivation. So it's envy, mistrust, and the aggression resulting from perceptions of economic and social inequality. So now we're going to look at another theory called general strain theory. So sociologist Robert Agnew's general strain theory helps us to identify the micro level or individual level influences of strain. Whereas Merton and Messner and Rosenfeld try to explain social class differences in the crime rate, Agnew now tries to explain why individuals who feel stress and strain are likely to commit crimes. Agnew also offers a more general explanation of criminal activity among all elements of society rather than restricting his views to crime amongst the lower social economic class. And he also suggests that criminality is the direct result of negative affect states, the anger and frustration that emerges in the wake of destructive social relationships. And he finds that negative affect states are produced by a variety of sources of strain. And while they're in your textbook, we're going to go over them just briefly. So the first one is failure to achieve positively valued goals. The cause of strain, similar to what Merton speaks of in his theory of anomie, is a result of the disjunction between aspirations and expectations. The next one he talks about is the disjunction of expectations and achievements. Strain can be produced by, again, the disjunction between expectations and achievements. When people compare themselves to peers who seem to be doing a lot better financially or socially, even those doing relatively well, feel some strain. The next one is removal of positively valued stimuli. Strain may occur because of the actual or anticipated loss of positively valued stimuli. So like the loss of, let's say, a girlfriend or a boyfriend or something like that. And the last one is presentation of negative stimuli. Strain may be also caused by negative or noxious stimuli, such as things like child abuse or neglect, or crime victimization, or physical punishment, family or peer conflicts, school failure, or stressful life events that lead up to some of these other issues related to strain. And here's a picture of how it looks. And you can see that we've got the sources of strain on the left, and then it leads to these negative affective states. And then here comes in the different types of antisocial behavior, which is the coping mechanism portion of it. So that's the kind of the outline of the general strain theory. And again, while it's a lot of data and stuff, there's a chart here for you that talks about the theories, gives you kind of the major premise, if you will, the strengths, and some of the research focus, just to kind of break it down. Now let's look at the, I believe, close to the last part of some of these strain theories, if you will, and we're going to talk about cultural deviance theory. The third branch of social structure theory combines the effects of social disorganization and strain to explain how people living in deteriorated neighborhoods react to social isolation and economic deprivation. Because their lifestyle is draining, frustrating, dispiriting, members of the lower socioeconomic class create an independent subculture, a clique, within its own set of rules and values, whereas middle class culture stresses hard work, delayed gratification, formal education, and being cautious. The lower subclass or subculture stresses excitement and toughness and risk-taking and fearlessness and immediate gratification and even street smarts. So a lot of these can trap you into a kind of a subculture. So the subculture of the lower socioeconomic class is an attractive alternative because the urban poor find it impossible to meet the behavioral demands of middle-class society. However, subculture norms often clash with conventional values. Urban dwellers must violate the law in order to obey the rules of the deviant culture with which they are in immediate contact. So again, it can trap you into this group or this culture. And with that being said, let's kind of look at a couple of different cultures that formulate within here. So this combines a couple of different things, effects of social disorganization and strain. Again, we talked about subculture norms that often clash with conventional values. And again, some people can kind of get caught up or trapped in that. And I have a video that you can look at if you want, that if you watch it, you'll start to see how this particular group acts, even when they're being filmed. And we use gangs a lot of times to talk about it because a lot of kids are drawn to the culture of gangs, if you will. And that's kind of why I tend to use that. So when you look at gang culture, the cultural deviance model assumes that kids will be drawn to the culture of a gang. And adolescents who feel alienated from the normative culture can find a home in a gang. In a disorganized area, gangs are a stable community feature rather than a force of disruption. Gang membership has appeal to adolescents who are alienated from their families as well as the mainstream of society. And it's not surprising that kids who have problems with the law and suffer juvenile justice processing are more likely to join gangs than, let's say, non-stigmatized individuals. So more than 50 years ago, sociologist Walter Miller identified unique conduct norms that help define lower class culture. He referred to these as focal concerns, and according to Miller, clinging to lower class focal concerns promotes a couple of different things. And that's kind of where we're going to go right now. if I can find where I'm at. Okay, so the first one is promotes illegal or violent behavior. Hang on, I kind of just got turned around for a second here, and I want to make sure that I get all these different things in here. The second one is toughness, or the fighting prowess, if you will. The third one is street smarts. I'm talking about, drug dealing. The fourth one is excitement, again, which could be things like drinking or drug abuse. And these subculture values, again, are handed down from one generation to another in a process called cultural transmission. And to some criminologists, the influence of lower class focal concerns and culture seems as relevant today as when it was identified by Miller about a half a century ago. There's an interesting article in your book called The Code of the Streets. It's on page 194. You can look at that if you want, and it might give you a little bit more kind of open eyes, if you will. Still on cultural deviance, again, gang culture assumes that kids will be drawn to the culture of gangs, and adolescents who feel alienated from this normative culture, they can find their place in gangs. There is a theory of delinquent subculture. So Albert Cohen first articulated this theory of delinquent subculture in his classic 1955 book called Delinquent Boys. And Cohen's central argument was that delinquent behavior of the lower class youth is actually a protest against the norms and values of middle class U.S. culture. And because social conditions prevent them again from achieving success legitimately, lower class youths experience a form of culture conflict that Cohen calls status frustration. And as a result, many of them may join gangs and engage in a behavior that is non-utilitarian, malicious, and extremely negative. And so the status frustration, by definition, is a form of culture conflict experienced by lower class youths because social conditions prevent them from achieving success as defined, let's say, by the larger society, if you will. So Cohen viewed, again, viewed the delinquent gang as a separate subculture, possessing a value system directly opposed to that of the larger society. He described the subculture as one that takes its norms from the larger culture but kind of turns them upside down. And he goes on to say that the delinquent conduct is the right by standards of his subculture precisely because it is wrong by the norms of the larger culture. So he continues to say or talk about something called the middle class measuring rod. And one significant handicap that lower class children face is the inability to positively impress authority figures such as teachers, employers, or supervisors. In U.S. society, these positions tend to be held by members of the middle class who have difficulty relating to the lower class youngster. And Cohen calls the standard set by these authority figures the middle class measuring rod. Along with that would be formation of deviant subcultures. And Cohen believes, again, that low-class boys rejected by middle-class decision makers usually join one of three existing subcultures. The corner boy, the college boy, or the delinquent boy. And you can read about those in your textbook. All right, so finishing up, we want to talk about the theory of differential opportunity. In their classic 1960 work, Delinquency and Opportunity, Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin combine strain and social disorganization principles to portray a gang-sustaining criminal subculture. The centerpiece of this theory is what is called differential opportunity. According to this concept, people in all strata of society share the same success goals. However, those in the lower class have limited means of achieving them. People who perceive themselves as failures within conventional society will seek alternative or innovative ways to succeed. And because of differential opportunity, young people are likely to join one of three types of gangs. The first is a criminal gang that exists in a stable neighborhood where close connections between kids, young adults, and adults create an environment for successful criminal enterprise. The second is what they call a conflict gang, and this is developed in communities and unable to provide either legitimate or illegitimate opportunities, where members are ready to fight. And the last one are retreatist gangs, kind of like double failures, and they look for ways to deal with that by doing things like drinking or getting high. So again, I have the chart listed for you here so you can look at it. So don't get all, don't stress out about the different theories, because each one talks about, we've got little definitions of each one to help you kind of get through it. So what about social structure theory and public policy? Well, social structure theory has significantly influenced public policy. If the cause of criminality is viewed as a schism between lower class individuals and conventional goals, norms, and rules, it then seems logical that alternatives to criminal behavior can be provided by giving inner city youths opportunities to share in the rewards of conventional society. And one approach is to give indigent people direct financial aid through things like public assistance or welfare. And although welfare has been curtailed under the Federal Welfare Reform Act of 1966, research does show that crime rates decrease when families do receive some type of supplemental income through public assistance or something similar to that. Okay, I know that was a lot. We've made it within our 60-minute time frame. We're just right on the edge. Please take the time to go back through and look at the definitions or the key terms at the end of each chapter and that are posted in Canvas. And also, don't forget to review the critical thinking questions that are also located at the end of the chapter as well. With that being said, that will conclude our lecture on Chapter 6, and until next time.